Allie was born in snowy Michigan, grew up in dry North Texas, and fell in love with rainy Louisiana while attending LSU. Allie discovered her love for native plants through podcasts and working with Swampfly Native Landscape out of Baton Rouge after studying plant diseases in graduate school. She's cooking up new ways to help native plants through her business, Wild Heart Gardens, and believes every native plant we help take root makes a difference.
Good enough? Okay, thank you. All right, like I mentioned, I'm not like an expert. I have a whole lot of imposter syndrome going on, but I do have a little bit of experience with invasive plants. Worked with Swampfly and do some work with Wild Heart, identifying plants to take out when we install new beds, and also through maintenances, making sure that we take out anything that could become a problem and fight with our natives. I was lucky enough to attend a workshop through BREC, which is the organization that manages the public parks in Baton Rouge. So that workshop was really helpful. You'll see quite a bit of information from their presentation in my presentation. I appreciate them letting me use their very good information. And I've done a little bit of work in my own backyard with invasives. We deal with primarily Chinese tallow and climbing fern, which I'll pass out here in just a little bit, Japanese climbing fern, and a lot of privet out where we are. So I have a couple of years experience continually battling those plants. As I'm sure you all know, it's a continuous process. And I wanted to mention that we all probably have some experience with invasive plants and aggressive plants, and I want everybody to feel free to, at any point during this presentation, to raise your hand, add a comment, ask a question. Totally welcome to do that. I'd love for people to share their experience with some of the plants I've got in this presentation and any other plants that people want to ask about. So these, just a quick outline. I want to talk about a couple definitions to get started, and then talk a little bit about general management strategies, some tips that apply to most invasives and aggressives that you're trying to manage, do a little bit of botany to help us know our enemies, and then go over a couple examples and hopefully ask everybody for input on what species they struggle with themselves. So definitions. So a native plant, pulled this from Wild Ones. A native plant is a species that occurs naturally in a particular region, ecosystem, and/or habitat, and was present prior to European settlement. There's a little bit of controversy or conflicting ideas about what a native plant is. Some people like to consider it more on like a scale of geologic time. But the main concept is just that natives have relationships with other organisms around where they live, and they're integrated in the food web. So they have predator relationships, and they have disease relationships, and they have beneficial relationships with insects, for example, all the things we love about them. So an exotic plant then is just the opposite of that. Also known as an alien, an introduced or non-native species, they are those that are transferred to a new geographic location previously unoccupied by that species. From Wildlife and Fisheries there. Wildlife and Fisheries has an action plan document that has a huge long list of plants that they consider invasive in Louisiana. And exotic species, they get introduced accidentally. Sometimes plants are used for like packing material, right? And they'll get propagated that way, any number of ways, and often through the ornamental nursery trade. We'll talk about a couple today that's how they got here, and that's how one of the ways they're continuing to get here. So exotic is the opposite of a native plant, and emphasis on they don't have relationships with the local food web. So an invasive species then is an exotic species that causes harm. In 1999, President Clinton put out an executive order that established a committee to help deal with invasive species of all kinds for the US. It has to do with diseases and animals and plants. And it defined an invasive species as an alien species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So invasives cause harm. They do not have predator relationships where they are. They tend to grow rampant and crowd out other species. So they cause harm, and we're going to do what we can to fight against them. An aggressive plant, on the other hand, it's a less technical term. The Chicago Botanic Garden suggests that an aggressive plant is just one that spreads faster than is preferred, or into an area of your garden where it is unwanted, and that a plant may be aggressive in one area, but not be aggressive and be more well-behaved in another area. So aggressive it's a less technical term, so I'm going to stick to mainly addressing invasives, but if anybody wants to talk about aggressive plants they want help managing, please feel free to bring them up. All right, talk a little bit about management. I know I'm preaching to the choir about how important it is to get rid of invasives, but wanted to take a little time on this graph that I got from the Breck presentation and just kind of focus on every little bit that we can do helps, because each plant that we take out is one less source of inoculum, one less source of propagules, right? So unfortunately, in Louisiana, we are kind of at a nexus for all types of introduction of different species. We're a major trade route, global trade route. We have a very moderate climate, so a lot of things can take root here. And so it's out of our control that we already have a bunch of invasive species already established here. So we might not be able to eradicate species from the state at this point without a lot of effort, but in each new area, this graph kind of restarts, right? So like on your property, on your land, you can do what you can to prevent and eradicate and contain, and that every little bit helps there. Wanted to share some acre estimates of coverage for some invasive plants. For the Chinese tallow, it's estimated that they cover about 137,000 acres in Louisiana. This is for the state of Louisiana, which is a lot of acres, but for perspective, it's about 0.4% of the state. So there's a lot of work to be done, but it's not hopeless. Chinese privet is about 103,000 acres, and Japanese climbing ferns about 74,000 acres, glossy privet about 27,000 acres. So there's a lot of plants out there, but we have the tools, we have the technology, we can make a difference. Yes, go ahead.
I don't know what glossy privet is.
Yeah, glossy privet, it's another ligustrum species, also from Asia. I don't know a lot about it myself, but I imagine it's an opposite leaf plant like the Chinese privet is, and it could be. I'm not super familiar with it, but I'll talk in just a second. Let's see, are we there yet? No, but there's a couple of resources I'll share that'll have information on so many plants. Thanks for asking. I expect a lot of us have seen this graphic before, just to help drive home that while we might not be able to say you have a giant Chinese tallow tree in your backyard and you don't have the resources to cut it down. Speaking from experience here, we have several. While you might not be able to take out the whole tallow tree where it's densely infested in the middle yellow circle there, I can go around my property every year and take out plants from the bleeding edge, from the perimeter. I can get the outliers, and that helps reduce the propagules, helps reduce the exponential growth of all these plants. So if you need a place to start, start with the farthest flung ones you can, take out the young ones, and that counts too. So some general strategies. Prevention, as we all know, planting natives is helpful for so many ways. It can help crowd out invasives. Just occurred to me. I have copies of these slides, obviously, and if anybody wants them, we can send them out after the meeting. So you're welcome to take notes. You're welcome to take. Yeah, and you can get them on the website as well, just in case, so you don't have to scramble and write everything down if you don't want to. You're welcome to, but you don't have to. So yeah, planting natives can be a form of prevention. There are many different types of mechanical removal that you can do, manual, whether physically by hand pulling, mowing, chopping. using an axe if it's that large of a critter, loppers, hand shears, all of these things can work. Burning I tend to leave to the professionals because it can get out of hand really fast. I tend to also leave chemical control to the professionals. I don't like using chemicals. There's a lot of regulations. As I was taught in school, the label is the law, so if you're gonna use chemicals, please just follow all the safety rules and all the regulations, and the rules will help it work as effectively as possible. There are some studies being done at LSU and USDA for biological control of invasives, which is just releasing a certain organism to help manage an invasive. This is not something currently that is widely available to the public commercial audience. So we have to wait for more information on that. And kind of what I'm focusing on today is just integrated pest management, which you may know is just a multi-pronged approach that hinges on correct pest identification. If you can correctly identify what pest you're working with, then you can find out when they produce seed. You can find out if they're very likely to resprout from stumps, or if you just top kill it and it'll go away. So I'm going to focus now a little bit on
With the mechanical approach, I heard an approach where you cut off the top, the growing part, and you cut it high, and then you cut off the next as it tries to grow back, and then you cut off as it tries to go back, and then that'll eventually kill it.
Yeah.
Seen that work?
Yeah, so this is something that I've heard from Dr. Allen mention this at one of his events that I was lucky enough to be able to go to. Patty's talking about a strategy where it's a lower effort strategy where instead of like trying to dig up a plant, which can take a lot of effort and disturb the soil, which can introduce new unwanted species and all of this, you top cut a plant. The strategy I'd heard before is like 2 or 3 feet above the ground, and then you wait a week or two, and then you come back and you cut at ground level. And that's the strategy we use for the privet on our property that are small enough to cut, so maybe like 1 to 2 inch diameter with a pair of loppers. And it works pretty well. It works pretty well for privet in my experience. I think it's definitely worth a shot, even if you're not completely capable, even if you don't completely kill the roots off, you're severely knocking back its reproductive capacity. So, and it's gonna resprout and be a smaller plant to deal with. So even if it doesn't kill the plant in 2 cuts, you're gonna be reducing the amount of seed that it can produce. Go ahead.
With the privet, I've done that method, and then when it started growing back, I took like an old feed bag or soil bag that the light don't get through, and I covered it over. And it took maybe 2 years, but then one day I kicked the root
And it came right out. Yeah, so recommendation is if you do the multiple cuts over time to shade the plant when it's trying to regrow, some kind of bag that shades out the plant, that's definitely a strategy, and it's a lot lower effort than digging out roots, for sure, for sure. I'm so sorry. Thanks for letting me know.
Let me try to raise it a little bit more.
Please do tell me I am not loud.
It works okay.
Okay, that's it.
Be really close. Okay, I'll do my best. Thanks. Yeah. So Dr. Allen did mention that the cutting 2 to 3 feet above the ground and then cutting back at ground level a week later, that's going to be most effective in the spring when the root reserves are lowest, when the plant has gone across winter and had to use its sugar stores to survive the winter, and it's trying to put out more top growth. So if you're going to try that, I suggest in the spring in maybe like a month or 2. That's usually when we go around and do our privet inquisition. Another general strategy is best to act when seeds are not present, so you're not knocking seeds around and putting them in the ground. That's not always possible. Sometimes you can collect the seeds and then knock the plant around as needed for cutting and piling. If you are manually pulling, if you're trying to wrench plants out of the ground by their roots, or using a tree wrench or a shrub wrench, which is a cool doodad that I got to see at Breck. It's best to work when the soil is moist, right? Because the ground will be softer and you're more likely to get all of the roots to come out at once instead of fragmenting. And then a lot of these plants can resprout from like root fragments. So if you can get as much of the roots in one go as possible, moist ground is better for that. Where possible, if you can bag up your debris from your plants that you're removing and then dispose of them through, unfortunately, landfill services, that can help prevent rerooting. We've had some privet and especially tallow, if you cut it and then you leave it, it can just reroot itself and it'll grow all funky, but it'll keep on, it'll keep trying. So if you can bag and dispose of what you can, some materials can be burnt. Instead of bagging, you just want to be careful. Some plant propagules that are very light can be distributed by the updrafts from fire, like fern spores. Those can be distributed by fire wafting. So, if possible, go ahead.
What is a tree wrench? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So they're mechanical. It's like a giant. The idea is like it's a big lever, right? It's a big pole, and it has a little grabbing section at the bottom. So it's about person height. Yeah, it's a hand tool. It's purely analog. It doesn't have a power source or anything besides the human using it, and it's got you kind of like it's got like a grabbing section, and you put it at the base of whatever you're trying to pull, and then when you put pressure on the top of the pole, it like wrenches it up. Yeah.
It's called a Big Daddy Extractigator.
Big Daddy Extractigator. I love it. Good marketing.
They have different sizes, but I got the biggest one because I'm working on trying to get privet at the Gloucester Arboretum that's by a creek, and I
Yep.
didn't want to use chemicals.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
getting the LSU students over there and to see how they're going to fight over whose turn is it next.
Oh yeah. Oh, that happened at the Breck event. People wanted to use the shrub wrench. It's pretty cool.
It's called polar bear.
Polar bear. Yep.
Polar bear.
Mm-hmm.
I ordered one for the Audubon Society. Use that also.
Yeah. Theoretically, if you Google search for tree wrench, you can see them. I'll have a picture later up when we talk about privet. Yeah. Just as a creative idea, some species are readily eaten by grazing animals. I read in the literature that privet is readily eaten by goats and sheep of that nature and critters of that nature. So whatever creative ideas you have, we need all of the effort that we can give. So I wanted to give you guys a bunch of places to find more information because we only have so much time here together today. So I hope to give you as many tools as possible for you to be able to go out and do your worst to all of the invasives. One thing that I mentioned earlier, the list of species that are considered invasive in Louisiana comes from the Wildlife and Fisheries Wildlife Action Plan, specifically Chapter 6. It's all about invasive species. It's got animals, it's got plants. And I encourage everybody to familiarize themselves if they're interested in those plants. Make sure you don't buy any, but of course, if you're buying a native plant, it's not invasive, so that makes it easy. The LSU Ag Center does have a webpage for their research on invasive species and invasive species management. You can find it on their website. It talks a little bit about their biological control processes that they're investigating and their data collecting work. If you want a slightly broader view, USDA has an invasive species site here. And these next two top resources here I found to be really, really, really useful and really helpful. So the Forestry Service has a field guide for the identification of invasive plants in southern forests. And this, I can't say enough good things about this document. It has so many pictures of the invasive species, and each picture has the month in which it was taken on it. So you can kind of see across the year what the plant might look like, different times, when it's gonna flower, when it's gonna put out seed. Made use of a bunch of their photos in this presentation. Really good source of information. I have an Android phone. I don't have an Apple, so I haven't been able to test out this app, but there's an app on the Apple Store called Invasives in Southern Forests by Charles T. Bargeron, and it's based off of the information in the Forestry Service Field Guide. So I encourage you to look at that if you're looking to identify some invasives. Of course, there are plenty of other plant identification apps. I know some favorites are iNaturalist and by extension Seek. And I encourage people, always encourage people to use those, but also to learn a little bit of botany so you can verify the identification. So let's go through some botany real quick. I want to talk about leaf classifications because leaves are around most of the year here in the South. And they tend to stick around longer than flowers or fruits. So they're a good reference for plant identification. I want to talk briefly about leaf arrangement, major vein arrangement, divisions, margins, and shapes. Okay, so I'm going to channel my inner Charles Allen here. He taught me how to do all of this. Does anybody know what this first arrangement is, where you've got two leaves flanking each other? Yes, that is opposite, where they are on opposite sides of the stem. And what about this one, where they kind of go across the stem? Alternate, yep. And then how about these guys, when there's three or more leaves together? Whorled, yep. Compound is coming up. And what about this guy, where there's a bunch of leaves on the ground and a stalk coming up? Basal rosette, yeah, you guys are awesome. So that's those guys, and then those are the most common that you're gonna come across is these arrangements. These are some rare ones, perfoliate, where the leaf is perforated by the stem goes through the leaf, clasping, where the leaf kind of joins behind the stem, and sessile, where the stem is directly connected to the leaf, there's no petiole. And then major vein arrangement, if you have one major vein, one raised or sunken major vein as the midrib, that's called pinnate, like a feather. And then if you have 3 or 5 or 7, et cetera, major veins that spread out from the base, they're connected at the base, that's called palmate. Then some leaf divisions. If it's just a basic leaf, one leaflet, if you will, that's called a simple leaf. And then you can be compound, as you were saying, in a bunch of different ways. Pinnately compound, like a feather arrangement. Palmately compound, trifoliate, like poison ivy, bipinnately compound, and leaves can get really complex. Leaf shape, I'm less concerned with learning all of the fancy names. You can always look them up. And the truth is that leaves can vary a little bit on the same plant. In the climbing fern, for one, they vary a lot. So I'm less concerned about this than the others, but if you need to look up the fancy names, you can. Leaf margin is usually pretty consistent across a plant. I wanted to point out here that entire is also known as smooth, a smooth margin, and that crenate can also be known as scalloped. Dentate is like teeth, little teeth. Serrate is like larger teeth usually. You've got wavy, pinnately lobed. I just wanted to refresh everybody on some of these terms to help know your enemy. Okay, so I wanted to talk about a couple of examples real quick. While I'm doing that, Miss Patty, would you mind passing out some of these? This is Japanese climbing fern from my backyard. I know. There's, I want people to see the roots on those, and just have something to do while I'm.
So keep it open or pass it out?
You could take them out. I want people to see the roots. Yeah, all right. Thanks, Patty. Doing the hard work today. All right, so up first, I wanted to talk about Chinese tallow tree. Pop quiz, can anybody tell what this leaf arrangement is here? Yep, it's alternate. Tallow tree is also called popcorn tree. And yeah, alternate leaf arrangement, that's right, excellent, excellent. Tallow is a medium-sized tree, up to about 3 feet in diameter, which is pretty big, 50 feet tall plants. We've got, unfortunately, some of those on our property. They are alternate, like alternately arranged leaves, like you correctly identified. They are simple. They generally have green leaves. They do turn color in the fall, which it breaks my heart to take out fall color plants because I miss the fall color in Michigan, but these ones are bad, they have to go. The, the leaves have smooth margins. Flowers are arranged in a spike, as you can see here, and fruit form in the fall. And they turn into these white waxy seeds, which is the popcorn name there. Yeah. So unfortunately, tallow trees, they can produce seed as young as 3 years old, which is kind of fast for a tree, as you might imagine. But the good news is, if you can get them before they're 3, you're doing a great service. Resprouting from roots is really common with the Chinese tallow tree. If you cut the tree down, it's gonna keep sprouting. A couple of ways to prevent that are to cut multiple times if you can. If the smaller plants, you can just like snip them and then come back and snip them again. That works, knocks them back. And some of the techniques they taught us at Breck are the hack and squirt, which is where you make a cut in a couple of spaces around the stem and then directly apply the pesticide in that cut. And then also cut and paint, where you sever the stem entirely and you paint your pesticide on the growing rim. You don't have to go across the whole stump, but where the phloem is active around the ring there. So those are some options for tallow. And then my nemesis, Chinese privet. Can anybody tell here what the leaf arrangement is on this guy? Yep, they are opposite.
It also looks a lot like Yopon holly.
Yes, the color of the leaves and the glossiness of the leaves looks a lot like Yopon holly, which is native, but we can tell the difference by a couple of ways. A big one being that the privet it has opposite leaves. And Dr. Allen taught us that if your leaves are arranged opposite, your stems are gonna be arranged opposite too. So if you have opposite stems and opposite leaves, it's probably a privet. These guys are mid-story shrubs, up to about 30 feet. They have opposite leaves, opposite branches, simple leaves. And their leaves, they have smooth margins. That's another difference between a privet and a Yopon holly, is the Yopon holly have scalloped edges. And the Yopons, their leaves are a little bit thicker. These tend to be a little bit like wavier and not as thick. But the best way to tell them apart is gonna be the opposite leaves and the fruits and the leaf margins. These guys flower, they have white flowers, they're in kind of like these loose clusters. The immature fruits, they're like a light green drupe, kind of looks like a berry. And they form in the summer and they mature to black. Yopon holly have red fruits, so that's helpful if your plant has red fruits. It's probably, and it looks sort of like this and it's a shrub, it's probably a holly, you're probably okay. But if it has black fruits, chances are good it's a ligustrum. Did I just lose my thing? There we go. Yeah, so here are the fruits here in kind of these loose clusters, and they're pretty distinct. If you've got your opposite leaves and black fruit, chances are good it's a privet. Like I mentioned before, we do the cut multiple times at our property. We just go around with our loppers and just, I'll usually like mark them. I'll get like a Sharpie and like make a mark and then cut above it so I can kind of remember what I've cut. And then we come back in like a week and just cut them down to the ground. And that does pretty well for young plants. For larger plants that have more root stores, it's often gonna take more than that. Digging is an option. Privets tend to be generally shallowly rooted. They're not gonna be as deeply rooted as like a tallow. Or you can use a shrub wrench. Like I mentioned before, it's this lever-looking thing. It's got a little foot here, and then it's got a little cup-shaped area here that grasps the stem when you pull back on the lever. Those work pretty well. And again, if you can go when the soil's a little moister, it's going to help you get more of the roots out. There are foliar pesticide sprays or cut and paint options for privet as well. There are other privet species, like we mentioned. I think there's like 5 or 6 different species in the Wildlife Action Plan. Some of the more prevalent ones are the Japanese privet, the glossy privet, and the common European privet. They all have opposite leaves. They all have black fruits. And you can manage them all in the same ways. You can pull them out or you can poison them. Ardesia is one that you may recognize from nursery centers. They're, fun facts, all 3 of these that I've talked about today were introduced by the ornamental trade and are still being sold. This coral ardesia sucks a lot because the berries kind of float, and so they get into lowland areas in like our parks and natural areas, so they're a problem. Also called hen's eyes. Can anybody guess what the leaf margin is here? Yep, they are scalloped or crenate. They're very distinct. These leaves on coral ardesia, they get pretty big. It's like the plant is like all leaf. The leaves can be like 8 inches long. These leaves are very, very thick. And these plants tend to be evergreen. So you can kind of look for them all year round. They do have very distinct crenate margins. It's very pronounced, wavy edges. They have white or pinkish flowers in axillary clusters, which just means that they kind of like occur inside the plant. They're not like at the tip of a branch, they're inside. And they've got these bright red fruit. Holly fruit are good, ardesia fruit are bad. They can persist throughout the winter. And management, something they taught us at Breck was if you can get a straight-backed hammer, you can use that as use the weight of it to kind of like dig into the ground and then use the hammer to lever it out. So that can help with, it is soil disturbance, but it's less than trying to dig up the whole root ball. So that's an option if you want to take out some frustration on some ardesia. I recommend grabbing a hammer. And another unfortunate thing about the ardesia is their seeds have a really high germination rate. I think it's somewhere above like 80%. So unfortunately, if you see a berry, it's probably going to sprout into another plant. There's a recommendation that if you're going to be strangling these plants and trying to pull them out, that if you can, do it when there are no seeds or carefully grab the seeds. I see it. There's some going around in the audience. To remove the seeds into like a bucket or put a tarp around where you're working to try and just capture as many of those seeds as possible because it's very likely it'll sprout. There are foliar or basal pesticide sprays. Basal just meaning you can spray them at the base of the plant. Yeah, that's ardesia. They're awful. Please do. Anger management with Ardesia, for sure, for sure.
Another one, Ardesia japonica.
I'm not familiar with Ardesia japonica. I suspect it's also invasive.
It's a ground cover that I got because I loved when I was working in New Orleans. I would go down on the streetcar line and along St. Charles Avenue, and I saw the Ardesia japonica as a ground cover, and I thought it was great. So I brought it up here when I moved up here, and I planted it. It took 10 years for it to cover what I wanted it to cover, and then I found out about invasive, and now it's going to take me 10 years to get it out.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's what I got, it's a vine. It's
No, no.
well, what I got is a brown vine, but it looks like that.
It doesn't look quite like that.
Invaded everywhere.
Yeah, I encourage everybody to get a look at the Ardesia roots. They're like, they're kind of distinct. They're like long kind of straight on the Ardesia. So if you can pull those out, all the better.
And it makes the red berries too.
Yeah. So I've got one last example here, and then I'm happy to open the floor to everybody's experiences and requests for aid. I wanted to talk about Japanese climbing fern. It's a perennial vining fern, climbing and twining. It can grow up to like 90 feet tall up trees. They're kind of serious. They have lacy, finely divided fronds along green to orange to black wiry vines, or technically it's a rachis because ferns don't have stems. They have fronds and rachis. The fronds do appear opposite on the vine. They're very compound, once or twice divided. They vary a lot in appearance on the same plant based on how old the leaf is, whether it's like a newly emerged leaf, whether it's reproducing, whether it has the sporangia or not. The leaf shape changes a lot on these plants, but they have a generally lacy appearance, and they produce tiny wind-dispersed spores from sporangia, which are the tiny spore-producing dots on the bottom side of the fronds in late summer to fall. And the spores are very dispersible. They'll cling to clothes, they'll cling to dogs, they'll cling to pine straw. If you use pine straw like I do for my business, it can be a really good practice to just monitor the areas for sprouts of the Japanese climbing fern, because that's one way that it gets dispersed. Yeah, wet soil is going to help. They have, I encourage you to take a look at some of the samples going around if you can, but they've got very wiry roots. And if you got to try and get as much of that out as you can. If all you can do is like cut it down, if it's climbing up the side of my house, it's climbing up my neighbor's trees. If all you can do is cut it down, that does help because you're reducing the spores that it's spreading. But if you can dig it out, that's going to be the best long-term solution. But wanted to talk about also that this particular species creates what some forestry people will call fire ladders. Normally, pine trees are incredibly fire resistant. They self-prune their branches so that when there's fire on the ground, their leaves don't get scorched and they still have all their breathing organs intact. But if there's an infestation of Japanese climbing fern, they'll just climb right up the tree and they'll lead the fire all the way up, especially through their dried out foliage. In some areas, the foliage will dry out and turn this brownish tanny color. In other places in the state, it stays green all year round, but it can produce fire ladders and damage our pine trees.
So if the spores are dispersed more in the fall, removal would be best in the spring?
Generally, yeah.
So that is my nemesis, and I know an awful lot about it. It gets more and more feathery as the season goes, and the spores on the back will be green, and then they turn brown. So when it starts getting feathery is when you got to really be concerned, and when it's brown, it's almost over because that's probably when it's going to be wind dispersed.
Yeah.
Anything else, Lee? I mean, that's
cut it. Yeah, that's another point. Like, unfortunately, battling invasives, it's an ongoing problem because birds eat seeds and birds fly and they sit on fence posts and they poop out seeds. And then you get more privet. you get wind dispersed ferns. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, the birds will definitely eat it. They'll take whatever food source they can get. Problem with privets is that they tend to like take over. So in a place where maybe you would have some yopons and you might have some, maybe you might have like some cedar, maybe you might have beautyberries, maybe you might have 5, 6, 7, 8 different species of woody understory, the privet will take over and clog the whole area. And it'll just make these giant mats. Yeah, and they just crowd out and they're very difficult to dislodge because we don't have any herbivores that predate on the privet. So, and we don't have the native diseases, so they just kind of clump and clog the ecosystem, and then we don't have sources of caterpillar food for our native caterpillars, and then we don't have food for the baby birds, and then we have less birds, and then we have more insects or more pest insects because we don't have, yeah, on and on like that. Yeah.
And another comment about the birds eating the seeds, so often with invasives, their nutrition value to our native species is not as high as our natives. So
Right.
like a tallow, you find lots of birds that eat tallow berries, but the tallow seed is a large seed with a waxy coating, and they're basically just eating the coating off, or they eat the entire seed because they can't get the coating off of the woodpecker. But it doesn't provide a lot of nutrition. But there's lots of seeds, so they just eat a lot, just like the privet, they just eat a lot. So, but as far as nutritional value, it has less than our native species.
Yeah, it's a good point. That invasives, because the organisms, the birds that live here, they don't have the evolutionary relationship with the plants, so the nutrition's not quite right. Yeah. So yeah, that's, wanted to acknowledge Sharon King. She gave me permission to use some of the slide information from the presentation. She encouraged me to share this contact information if anybody is interested in learning about where BREC has active invasive species control programs, because they have whole volunteer forces working on the public parks in Baton Rouge, because the tallow and the privet and the rhodesia and all this stuff are issues. So if you're interested in that, please contact her. And that's all the information I had.